The man they almost threw out of the reading of the will was the only one in the room telling the truth. His name was Desmond Ford, 61 years old, retired homicide detective, 28 years with the Atlanta PD. He wore a gray blazer that had seen better days, and he sat in a chair near the back of the room where no one expected him to say anything. That was their first mistake. The office of Harrington and Lyle, attorneys at law, occupied the 14th floor of a building in Buckhead, where the elevator smelled like money and the receptionist looked at you like she was calculating your net worth before you finished introducing yourself. On the morning of March 4th, that office was full of people who had driven up in vehicles that cost more than most Americans made in a year. They wore things that were pressed and tailored and deliberately understated in the way that only truly expensive things can afford to be. Desmond Ford had taken the bus. He was there because of Ida Beaumont Cross. That was the name on the estate. Ida Louise Beaumont Cross, 74, founder of Beaumont Logistics, a freight and distribution company she had built from a single leased truck and a telephone in 1979 into something that now employed over 4,000 people across 11 states. She had died 11 days earlier. Stroke, said the death certificate. Her cardiologist, a man named Dr. Elliot Swain, had signed it without apparent hesitation. Desmond had known Ida for 31 years. They met when he was investigating a warehouse robbery near her Decatur facility. She made him coffee. He found her stolen equipment. They became, in the way that people sometimes do across improbable distances, genuine friends. He had been to her house for Thanksgiving 6 times. He had once, at her insistence, slow danced with her at her nephew's wedding, while her late husband Harold watched from a lawn chair and laughed until he cried. She had called him 3 weeks before she died. He almost didn't answer. It was late. He was watching a Braves game, and the score was close, and he was 61 years old, and retirement meant you didn't have to answer the phone if you didn't want to. But it was Ida, and Ida never called past 9 unless something was wrong. She sounded tired, not sick tired, not old tired, scared tired, the kind of tired you get when you've been watching something happen for a long time, and nobody believes you. She told him about her son-in-law. His name was Garrett Lyle Cannon, 43 years old. He had married Ida's daughter Rochelle 9 years ago in a ceremony at a botanical garden in Virginia that Ida had paid for and had never complained about paying for, because Rochelle was happy, and when your child is happy, you don't put a price on it. Garrett was charming. Garrett was well-dressed. Garrett had an MBA from Georgetown and a firm handshake, and a way entering a room that made people think he had been expected. For the first 5 years, he worked at a consulting firm downtown. Then he didn't. He said the hours were incompatible with being a present husband and a good father to their daughter, Simone, who was 6 at the time, and Ida had no argument with that because she believed in fathers who showed up. Rochelle worked. Garrett managed the household. It seemed reasonable. What Ida had started noticing, she told Desmond, was the paperwork. Not all at once. It crept up on her the way winter does. You don't notice the days getting shorter until one afternoon you look out the window, and it's already dark at 5 o'clock, and you wonder when that started happening. A form here. A signature request there. A power of attorney document that her own attorney had not drafted, presented to her on a Tuesday afternoon when Rochelle was at a conference in Houston and Ida had a headache and Garrett was very calm and very helpful and had brought her water without being asked. She hadn't signed it. She didn't know why she hadn't, exactly. She said there was no single moment of suspicion, no alarm that went off. She just looked at the document, and then she looked at Garrett smiling at her from across the kitchen island, and she folded the papers and handed them back and said she needed to have her attorney review anything before she signed it. Garrett's smile had stayed exactly the same. That was the part that bothered her. The smile didn't change by even a degree. After that, she started paying attention differently. There was a financial advisor she didn't remember agreeing to. There was a life insurance review that her longtime insurer said had been initiated by her, except she had not initiated it. There was a conversation Garrett had on the back porch that she overheard through the kitchen window, something about accelerating the timeline, And when she came outside, he was already off the phone and asking if she wanted sweet tea. She told Desmond all of this in 40 minutes on the phone at 9:30 at night, and when she was done, she said, "I know how this sounds," he said. "It sounds like you're paying attention. Don't stop." He told her he would look into it quietly. He had contacts, 28 years of contacts. She thanked him and said goodnight, and he sat there after she hung up with the game still on and the sound muted, because some things rearrange the furniture in your mind, and you need a minute before anything else can fit. She was dead inside 3 weeks. The doctor called it hypertensive crisis, leading to hemorrhagic stroke. Ida had been managing high blood pressure for years. The medications were all accounted for. There was nothing on paper that looked wrong. Desmond went to the funeral. He stood in the third row and looked at Garrett Lyle Cannon, standing next to Rochelle with his hand at the small of her back, and he noticed the way Garrett's eyes moved around the room during the service. Not the way grieving people's eyes move. The way people's eyes move when they're waiting for something to be over. The reading of the will was scheduled for 11 days after burial. Desmond was not in the will. He knew that. He had no legal standing in that room. He came because Ida had asked him to in a voicemail left 4 days before she died, a voicemail he had listened to 17 times since her death, a voicemail in which her voice was steady and precise and entirely like herself. "Desmond, I need you to be there when they read the papers. I don't know what's in them, but I need someone in that room who knows what to look for. I need someone who isn't afraid of Garrett." So there he was, near the back, in the gray blazer. The room held 11 people. Rochelle sat in the front left, Simone beside her. Simone was 16 now, long legs and her grandmother's eyes, and she had been crying recently but was not crying now. Garrett sat 1 seat away from Rochelle with his right ankle crossed over his left knee. He looked like a man who had already read the room and found it satisfactory. There were cousins, a niece, a longtime business partner named Eugenia Voss, who had worked with Ida since the early years. There was Ida's personal attorney, Walter Osey, no relation to Garrett's side, a small, precise man who wore reading glasses on a chain and had been handling Ida Beaumont Cross's affairs for over 2 decades. There was also a second attorney. He had introduced himself to the room before Walter Osey began. His name was Foster Dunn. He represented, he said, Garrett Lyle Cannon's interests in certain matters pertaining to the estate. He sat at the side of the table with a leather portfolio and the posture of a man who had been to many of these rooms and was never the one who walked out empty-handed. Walter Osey began reading. The will opened the way wills do, a recitation of soundness of mind, of intent, of love for those left behind. Ida's voice, rendered in legal language, still sounded something like her. Desmond pressed his hands flat on his thighs and listened. The charitable bequests came first, substantial ones. Ida had been deliberate and generous with institutions she cared about, an HBCU scholarship fund, a literacy nonprofit in Southwest Atlanta, her church's building renovation project, then the business. Beaumont Logistics, the will stated, was to be held in trust for a period of no less than 5 years, managed by a 3-person board, to be named by Walter Osey in consultation with Eugenia Voss, with the goal of eventual transfer to Rochelle Beaumont Lyle and any designated successor she chose to name. Garrett Lyle Cannon was not named in the business succession, not once. Desmond watched Garrett's jaw set. The personal estate, the house in Buckhead, the property in coastal Georgia, liquid assets totaling approximately $14 million, was to be divided between Rochelle and a trust established for Simone's education and future. Again, Garrett was not named as a direct beneficiary. He would benefit as Rochelle's spouse, but nothing was his independently. Ida had been meticulous about the distinction. Foster Dunn cleared his throat. He said that he had something to introduce into the proceeding. He had, he said, a document, a codicil, executed approximately 6 weeks before Ida Beaumont Cross's death, that amended the distribution of the personal estate. He slid copies across the table. He said that under this codicil, Garrett Lyle Cannon was named co-trustee of Simone's Educational Trust, with full authority to direct distributions, and was additionally allocated a direct bequest of $3 million from the liquid assets, in recognition of his years of contribution to the Beaumont family. Walter O.C. picked up the document. He was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at Foster Dunn over his reading glasses. I was not informed of this codicil. Dunn said it had been executed through a separate estate planning firm. He named the firm. It was not a name anyone in the room recognized. Mrs. Beaumont Cross did not mention this to me, Walter said. The precision in his voice had gone very flat. In 31 years, she did not make a single change to her estate documents without informing me. Garrett spoke for the first time. His voice was warm, measured, faintly sorrowful. Ida wanted to handle some things privately. She didn't want to make a big production of it. She knew Walter might push back. Rochelle looked at her husband. Something moved through her face that she didn't yet have language for. Simone was looking at the table. Desmond stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He had spent 28 years in rooms where people were lying, and he had learned a long time ago that you don't need to raise your voice when you know what you know. You just have to say it clearly enough that no one in the room can pretend they didn't hear it. That signature isn't hers. Every head turned. Foster Dunn looked at him with the particular contempt that men in expensive suits reserve for men who appear without appointments. I'm sorry, who are you? Desmond Ford. I was a friend of Ida Beaumont Cross for 31 years, and that is not her signature. Dunn said, this document was properly witnessed and nota, the second U in her middle name. Desmond walked toward the table, and something about the way he moved made people get out of his way. He set his finger beside the signature on the codicil. Ida Louise Beaumont Cross. She always wrote her U in cursive with a back loop. Left from her third-grade teacher in Macon. She talked about it once. I thought it was an odd thing to remember, but I remembered it. He pointed to the signature on the codicil. This U is printed. Whoever practiced this signature practiced it from a typed name, not from watching her write. The room had gone very still. Garrett said, that is an absurd basis for. I also want to know, Desmond continued, as if Garrett hadn't spoken, because he had learned that skill too, the skill of rendering a liar's interruption into silence by simply not stopping, who initiated the change to Ida's blood pressure medication dosage approximately 3 weeks before she died. A sound moved through the room, not a gasp, quieter than that, more like the sound of people suddenly breathing differently. Rochelle said, what? Desmond looked at her, and he made sure his voice was direct, not gentle, because she was not a child, and she deserved the truth at full volume. Your mother called me 3 weeks before she died. She was frightened. She had noticed things. I was looking into them. I didn't move fast enough. He paused. I will not make that mistake again. Garrett stood up. The warmth was gone from his voice entirely now. This man is not a party to these proceedings. He has no standing. Walter. He raised a question, Walter O.C. said, without looking up from the codicil. The question stands. Foster Dunn was already gathering his portfolio. Walter said, you will leave that document on the table, Mr. Dunn. Dunn looked at him. Then he looked at Garrett. Then he set the portfolio down and sat back in his chair with the expression of a man recalculating. The next 48 hours moved the way investigations do when the first wall comes down. Fast and then faster. Desmond called in a forensic document examiner he had worked with for 15 years, a woman named Bet Cairns, who didn't need a court order to have a preliminary opinion, and who confirmed by the following morning that the signature on the codicil showed inconsistencies with Ida's authenticated writing samples in 9 separate characteristics. Not 1. 9. The estate planning firm that had supposedly drafted the codicil turned out to be a 2-year-old LLC registered to a man who, when the state bar investigated, turned out to have a law license from a state where he had also been disbarred. The notary stamp was real. The notary had been paid in cash. Dr. Elliot Swain, the cardiologist who had signed Ida's death certificate, was contacted by the Fulton County Medical Examiner's office after Desmond placed a call to a former colleague who had not forgotten the name Desmond Ford. The medical examiner requested Ida's pharmacy records. There were 2 prescriptions for her blood pressure medication. One was the prescription Ida's regular pharmacy had on file. The other was a newer prescription, filled at a different location, that had doubled the dosage. It had been called in by someone using Dr. Swain's credentials. Dr. Swain, when contacted, said he had not called in that prescription and had no record of doing so. He was also, it turned out, 2 years from retirement, carrying debt from a practice expansion that had not gone as planned, and had received a wire transfer of $22,000 from an LLC he describes consulting work that he was suddenly very reluctant to describe in any further detail. Garrett Lyle Cannon was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery. The district attorney, who was not someone who moved slowly when she had something, added a charge of conspiracy to commit murder before the week was out. Desmond sat in the Fulton County Courthouse hallway on a wooden bench and drank coffee from a cup that was not good coffee, and he thought about Ida calling him at 9:30 on a Thursday night. And he thought about how close he had come to letting it go to voicemail. Rochelle came and sat beside him. She didn't say anything for a while. Simone was inside with Walter Ossie, reviewing what the estate would look like now that the codicil had been invalidated and the fraud investigation had begun. Finally, Rochelle said, "She called you." "Yes, she didn't call me." He looked at her carefully. She didn't want to scare you before she was sure, and she didn't want Garrett to know she was sure. He paused. She was protecting you, right up to the end. Rochelle was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I knew something was wrong. I kept thinking. I kept telling myself I was being unfair to him, that I was being paranoid." She looked at her hands. "I stopped trusting what I saw. There was nothing to say to that, except the truth." "He was very good at that part," Desmond said. "Making you feel like the problem was your perception." She nodded. He finished his coffee. It was still bad. At the sentencing, 14 months later, the judge, a woman who had clearly read every page of the evidence and found all of it instructive, gave Garrett Lyle Cannon 11 years. Dr. Swain received 4 years and lost his medical license. Foster Dunn cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence and was disbarred. Simone gave a victim impact statement. She was 17 by then, and she stood at the podium in a navy dress, and she read every word she had written herself, and there was a line in the middle of it that Desmond thought about for a long time afterward. She said, "My grandmother built everything she had with her hands and her mind and 4 decades of work. She trusted people. That was not a weakness in her. That was a crime in them." Afterward, in the hallway, Simone found Desmond, and she hugged him. She was tall, like Ida. She had Ida's way of deciding something, and then simply doing it without announcement. She pulled back and looked at him and said, "She told me about you once. She said you were the kind of man who listened to the whole sentence." He didn't know what to say to that. "She meant it as the highest compliment," Simone said, "in case you were wondering." He was wondering. The real crime in that room on the 14th floor of that Buckhead building was not the forged codicil or the doubled prescription or the cash-paid notary. Those were instruments. The real crime was the assumption, held by Foster Dunn and Garrett Lyle Cannon and every expensive suit in that room, that a man in a gray blazer who came on the bus had nothing to say worth hearing, that a retired detective without a portfolio or a retainer had no business standing up in the middle of a formal proceeding and pointing at a signature. They had planned for lawyers. They had planned for auditors. They had planned for heirs. They had not planned for someone who remembered the way a woman wrote the letter "you" because she had mentioned it once 30 years ago, and he had been paying attention. That was enough.